had this really telling conversation recently. I was in Bern, in one of those quiet old world cafes, all dark wood and hushed tones, with a Swiss private banker.
Oh, the old guard.
Exactly. The kind of guy who probably thinks in centuries, not quarters. And for 20 minutes, he just waxed lyrical about the Swiss miracle. You know how for 200 years, Switzerland has been the world's safety deposit box.
The ultimate neutral ground.
That's the phrase he used. He tapped his gold watch and said, "We don't take sides. We provide the infrastructure for everyone else to play their games." Honestly, he was almost smug about it.
As if it were a law of physics, unchanging.
Completely. But then I brought up the new investment screening laws, the China Act, as people are calling it. Specifically, the parts that let the government block a foreign takeover of, say, the power grid or a precision manufacturing plant.
And I imagine the mood shifted.
It didn't just shift, it curdled. I mean, the calm, detached banker just vanished.
Yeah.
And in his place was this panicked fortress commander. He started talking about economic sovereignty and protecting the national soul.
Wow. From detached banker to patriot in seconds.
And he was talking about this industrial gravity from the East. So I pointed out, that this sounds a lot like picking a side. The very thing he said Switzerland doesn't do.
And what did he say?
He just snapped back. It's not picking a side, it's a survival reflex. They don't just want to bank here anymore. They want to own the literal gears of our country.
The gears of the country. That's a powerful image.
It was startling. That shift from this lofty ideal of neutrality to just raw, visceral fear. The fear of being outmaneuvered not by financiers, but by people who build things in the real world.
And that one man's anxiety, it's really the whole story in miniature. It's the sound of that 200-year-old myth cracking wide open.
So when the China Act passed on January 1st, 2026, it wasn't just another regulation. It was, in effect, a formal obituary for the Swiss haven.
It's an admission that neutrality isn't a moral stance anymore. It was. It was a luxury. A luxury afforded by a unipolar world that is, well, it's officially gone.
And in this new clash between what you could call financial parasitism and real industrial substance, that comfortable middle ground is always the first thing to disappear.
That visceral reaction you saw in that cafe, that sudden jump from detached principle to a panicked reflex, that really sums up the whole tectonic shift we're seeing. It's the sound of geopolitical gravity finally catching up with an economic model that thought for a couple of centuries that it was exempt.
Right.
So I think our mission for this deep dive is to get past the anecdotes and the rhetoric and look at the actual machine, the legal mechanism that's serving as this obituary.
The Investment Screening Act itself.
Exactly. We need to unpack the ISA, really dig into the economic and geopolitical forces that compelled Switzerland, of all places, to essentially abandon this 200-year tradition, at least in the economic domain, which is arguably the most important one now.
Absolutely. Because this is the perfect case study for how these huge, abstract global power shifts become, well, they become immediate physical realities. For you listening, the core conflict we're really digging into is this clash between, let's call it financial parasitism on one side.
The idea of profiting from virtual intermediation, managing wealth, frictionless capital.
Right, versus industrial substance on the other. The actual control and production of physical things, the goods, the tech, the infrastructure.
And that conflict is so profound now that it's forcing every economy, even the one most famously built on not taking sides, to pick a team. Okay,
so let's unpack this new reality, this new paradigm that is just completely reshaping how nations interact.
Yeah.
We're moving out of an era that was defined by, free trade for its own sake, and into one that's defined by geo-economics. And we can even go back to the military strategist Edward Luttwak, who coined this term back in 1990.
That's right, way back then. He defined it as the admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce.
Which is such an elegant way to put it. It perfectly captures this idea that your economy and your national security are not separate things anymore.
Exactly. For decades, the dominant idea, the neoliberal orthodoxy, was that trade was just about wealth. About market efficiency, accumulating capital, making the global pie bigger for everyone. Security was over here, economics was over there.
Two separate domains.
Completely. The geo-economic paradigm just throws that out the window. It says, no, wait a minute. Trade, investment, who controls the supply chains? These are primary strategic tools. They're tools for growing state power, for projecting influence globally. In many ways, they're more effective than traditional military force.
And when you look at who really understood this concept first, the evidence suggests it wasn't the Western powers. They were. They were still deep in that neoliberal mindset.
That's a crucial point. We have to observe that strategically, many nations in East Asia, particularly China, have been operating on these geo-economic and, mercantilist principles for years.
It wasn't a new idea for them.
Not at all. Their focus has been this long-term, very concerted effort to prioritize control over global manufacturing, to secure the critical minerals you need for all modern technology, and to build these incredibly integrated, resilient industrial systems that now span the entire globe.
And it's been an incredibly effective strategy.
Oh, extraordinarily effective. It's led to a dominant position in so many vital sectors. And this was all achieved while the West was, for the most part, focused on something entirely different.
Maximizing shareholder value.
Right. Through deindustrialization and offshoring. Moving the factories somewhere else because it looked better on a quarterly report without really thinking through the long-term strategic costs.
And that is the core of this Western reckoning we're seeing now, isn't it? This slow, dawning, and frankly panicked realization that concentrating the world's industrial capacity somewhere else has huge security implications.
Existential ones. For decades, the mantra was, the market will provide. Free markets would always optimize things, supply chains were flexible and could be rerouted.
And now there's this sudden urgency over dependencies, whether it's on rare earth minerals or semiconductor manufacturing, or even just, personal protective equipment during a pandemic.
It's completely altered the power dynamic. Now you see Western countries scrambling to pivot their trade and security policies at the same time. They're effectively playing catch-up, adopting this geo-economic model that not too long ago they would have dismissed.
It's a huge structural realignment. You could even trace it through the recent history of trade. You had, economic nationalism after World War I, then that embedded liberalism of the Bretton Woods system after World War II. But the most recent era, what some call globalization II, this period of really radical neoliberalism that basically hit a wall and started to collapse around 2016.
That's when the bill came due. That's when the strategic cost of putting financial efficiency ahead of industrial self-sufficiency just became, undeniable.
But I have to ask, is this shift really strategic? Or is it just reactive?
Yeah.
Are these new laws, these screening acts like the ISA, are they just administrative walls that slow things down but don't fix the fundamental problem, the problem being a lack of industrial capacity?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? The immediate legislative response is, without a doubt, defensive. It's a clear admission of vulnerability. You can see this transition from open markets to defensiveness just by looking at the laws being passed.
And the U.S. was one of the first big movers.
They were. The U.S. really signaled its alarm with the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which was passed back in 2018.
FIRMA. That's the law that essentially put the Committee on Foreign Investment, CFIUS, on steroids.
That's a good way to put it. It massively expanded CFIUS's oversight capacity. Before FIRMA, CFIUS mostly just looked at takeovers that gave a foreign entity clear control.
A majority stake.
Right. But FIRMA broadened the definition of a covered transaction. Now, it could include non-controlling minority investments, especially in sensitive areas like critical tech, infrastructure, or, and this is a big one, sensitive personal data.
So even just buying a 10% stake in a key startup could trigger a federal review.
Exactly. It was a clear recognition that foreign influence doesn't always need majority ownership. Sometimes all you need is strategic access, a board seat, a look at the R&D pipeline. That's enough to be a security risk. It's basically an administrative dragnet trying to filter geopolitical intent out of the flow of capital.
And Europe wasn't far behind, creating its own, a more decentralized version of this.
Correct. The EU established its FDI screening regulation in 2019, which came into effect in 2020. Now, this was pivotal, but not because it created some kind of European CFIUS. It didn't.
So what did it do?
It forced the member states to coordinate. It established a mechanism for them to share information. It required them to notify the European Commission and all the other member states when they were screening a foreign direct investment that might be a security risk.
So if Germany sees a worrying investment in, say, the port of Hamburg, they now have to flag that for Italy and France and everyone else.
Precisely. The logic is that a strategic asset in one member state can easily become a vulnerability for the entire single market, especially with capital flowing so freely across borders. The regulation pushed everyone to have transparent, non-discriminatory screening policies.
And most of them have complied.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
By September of 2024, 24 out of the 27 EU members had these mechanisms in place. You even saw countries like Ireland, a place historically built on being a hub for foreign investment, pass its own Screening Act in 2023 to get in line with the EU framework. That was hugely symbolic.
What's fascinating is just how global this trend is. It's not just a US-Europe thing.
Not at all. We are watching a definitive global defensive realignment. By 2023, something like 50 countries in OECD discussions had some form of FDI screening. Australia, Canada, Japan, you name it. Basically, any economy with strategic assets worth protecting has moved to protect them.
And that's the context in which Switzerland finds itself.
Yeah.
The famously open, non-aligned economy.
Is suddenly finding that it has to play catch-up. They're being forced to join a global defensive trend that's been building for more than half a decade, all because of the hard reality that political neutrality is no shield against industrial acquisition.
Which brings us right to the specific legal barricade that Switzerland is now putting up. This wasn't some proactive ideological choice. It feels much more like a delayed but necessary reaction. So let's really get into the nuts and bolts of Switzerland's response here. The Investment Screening Act, the ISA, the story behind it, as you've mentioned, points to one single massive deal that really lit the political fire.
It did. The unofficial name for the ISA for a long time was the Lex China, and that's for a very specific reason. The catalyst was the $43 billion takeover of Syngenta by ChemChina.
Back in 2016.
Right. And this deal wasn't just big in terms of money. It involved a Swiss national champion in a sector, agribusiness, biotechnology, that is absolutely critical to global food security.
So this wasn't just selling a watch company.
Not even close. This event really shocked the political establishment and the public. It sparked this intense national debate about what it means long-term to hand over control of that kind of strategic intellectual property and market position to a foreign state-controlled entity. That single deal created the political momentum for the government to finally move away from its traditional hands-off, laissez-faire approach to investment.
So after all those years of debate, what is the official purpose of the ISA? How does it try to walk that fine line between this new security anxiety and the classic Swiss brand of being open for business?
The official purpose, as it's written in the law passed on December 19th, 2025, is to prevent foreign takeovers if they pose a quantifiable threat to public order or national security in Switzerland.
A security policy instrument, then?
Purely. It's expected to actually come into force in 2027 at the earliest. But here's the crucial part, the compromise. In its attempt to build a defensive wall without, completely abandoning its identity, Switzerland chose a path that is significantly less interventionist than many of its peers.
How so? Where's the big difference?
The crucial limitation is in the scope. The Swiss law limits the screening obligation almost exclusively to foreign state investors.
Only state actors.
Or state-controlled entities. So we're talking about foreign government bodies, companies that are directly or indirectly controlled by a foreign state, or even individuals who are provably acting on behalf of a foreign state. This very specific focus filters out almost all purely private capital.
So a big private equity firm from New York or a private conglomerate from Tokyo could still, in theory, buy up a Swiss company without triggering this law.
In most cases, yes. It reflects a political judgment that the primary security risk comes from state-directed, politically motivated acquisitions, not from market-driven private deals.
That is a massive distinction from the American or even the broader EU systems, which can cast a much wider net. So they're essentially trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're saying, we still want your private foreign direct investment. We just want to filter out the geopolitical intent.
That's the political compromise in a nutshell. They're clinging to this shrinking commitment to market openness for private commercial capital. And there are other limits, too. For a deal to even be notifiable, it has to be a takeover.
Meaning you have to acquire control.
Decisive influence, as the law puts it. What we would understand as control. And it has to be over a domestic undertaking, which for legal clarity is just defined as any entity that's registered in the Swiss Commercial Register. The whole law is very narrowly tailored to try and minimize the administrative burden on the rest of the highly internationalized Swiss economy.
So to really understand how this works in practice, we have to look at the two-tiered threshold system they created. This is where the state really spells out what it considers truly critical versus just, important.
Exactly. The ISA sets up this very detailed structure. The lower threshold is for the most sensitive areas. A deal here only requires notification if the Swiss target company has at least 50 full-time employees and an annual turnover of at least 10 million Swiss francs.
So a relatively low bar. It's designed to catch even smaller but vital companies.
Precisely. It's designed to catch foundational infrastructure providers that might not be huge but are irreplaceable.
And what falls into that most sensitive category?
It's the absolute pillars of national security and societal function. First, any company involved in making defense or dual-use goods, or even just transferring the IP for them, if it's crucial for the Swiss armed forces or federal security agencies.
So protecting military tech.
Right. Second, companies that operate or control core energy infrastructure. We're talking about the domestic transmission grids, large power plants, or those high-pressure gas pipelines. Control over energy is a direct security issue.
Makes sense.
Third, any company that supplies water to a large chunk of the population, the law defines that as at least 100,000 people. And finally, providers of central security-related IT services, the systems that keep the government itself running.
So those four sectors are seen as just too fundamental to risk, no matter how big the company is.
Exactly. But then you have the higher threshold, which is designed to catch the other systemically important entities. They might not be core infrastructure, but if they failed or fell under foreign state control, it would cripple the entire country's circulatory system.
And what's the trigger for that one?
For the higher threshold, the deal is only notifiable if the target company's global turnover is more than 100 million Swiss francs.
So this is for the bigger fish.
The much bigger fish. And the sectors here include major hospitals, large pharmaceutical and medical device companies, and specifically vaccine and PPE producers, a lesson from the pandemic.
Of course.
It also includes key transport hubs like major ports, airports, and rail freight centers, big food distribution centers, domestic telecommunications networks, and very importantly, systemically important financial market infrastructures and banks.
That inclusion of banks is huge.
Yeah.
That feels like the final nail in the coffin for the idea of a completely separate, ring-fenced Swiss financial world.
It absolutely is. But here's what I find to be the most striking part of the law: the exclusions. And this is where the Swiss response seems strategically cautious, maybe even to a fault.
What's not on the list?
The really critical key technologies of the future, things like artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, quantum computing, they're not explicitly listed in the core scope.
Wait, really? That seems like a massive blind spot. The US and the EU are racing to control exactly those technologies.
It's a key detail that shows you just how cautious and procedural the Swiss approach is. Now, a semiconductor company could be caught if its products are considered dual use, but AI as a category isn't there. To extend the law to cover a field like AI would require a formal legislative amendment.
But strategically, in this geo-economic era we've been talking about, isn't that just a huge gamble? If the future of industrial power is defined by who controls AI and chip fabrication, why would Switzerland intentionally leave that door open?
It's not necessarily a gamble so much as a calculated risk based on their system. You have to remember, the Swiss system prizes predictability and legislative clarity above all else. By putting all the material requirements in the law itself, they create very high political hurdles to change it.
They don't want a regulator to have too much discretion.
Exactly. And the thinking is twofold. First, they want to avoid paralyzing their world-class R&D sector with red tape. They're hoping to stay an open environment for collaboration, especially with the West. Second, they're very wary of trying to define and regulate technologies that are evolving so fast. They're afraid they'd write a law that's obsolete before it even takes effect.
So they're sacrificing some domestic control in these future critical areas for the sake of regulatory stability and keeping capital flowing into their research hubs.
In effect, yes, it's a very Swiss compromise.
Okay, so let's walk through it. A state-controlled foreign investor wants to buy a Swiss power plant operator. It meets the lower threshold, 50 employees, 10 million francs. What happens next? How does the administrative machine actually work?
The procedure is rigorous, and it's modeled on merger control, but the stakes are much, much higher. The investor has to notify the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, that's SECO, before the deal is completed. And the most critical part is the standstill obligation.
Meaning everything freezes.
Everything.
Yeah.
The transaction is suspended under civil law. It cannot move forward until final approval is granted.
And what if they just ignore that? if they try to push the deal through anyway.
The penalties are designed to be a deterrent. They are severe. If you violate the standstill obligation, you face administrative penalties of up to 10% of the Swiss target's global annual turnover.
10% of global turnover. That's potentially billions.
It's designed to be catastrophic. This is not a slap on the wrist. A percentage-based penalty of that size is far beyond what you typically see in merger control. It's a clear signal that the state now treats national security violations with the absolute utmost seriousness.
It's meant to make sure state-backed giants even think twice. So SECO is the gatekeeper, but who makes the final call? Who can actually say no?
SECO coordinates the review, which happens in 2 stages. Phase I is a preliminary review. It lasts 1 month. They look at the application with other relevant government departments and, critically, the Federal Intelligence Service.
The spies get a look.
They do. If it's a clear-cut case, it can be approved right there. But if there are any concerns, it moves to an in-depth Phase 2 review, and that takes another 3 months. But, and this is key, if SECU or any other department opposes the deal, or if the decision is seen to have significant political implications, the final decision gets kicked upstairs.
To the top.
All the way to the Federal Council, which is the Swiss cabinet. Only the Federal Council can ultimately decide to prohibit a takeover. This centralization ensures that a prohibition, which is a huge political move in Switzerland, is a unified decision of the entire government.
And what are they looking for? What are the criteria for saying no? It can't just be a gut feeling.
No, it's a formalized risk assessment. They're looking for a reason to believe that public order or security is endangered or threatened. This involves a calculation, balancing the probability of a threat occurring against potential damage if it does.
And they look at the buyer's history.
Absolutely. The reputation of the foreign state investor is examined very closely. Is there documented involvement in espionage, organized crime, sanctions evasion? Any of that is a major red flag. They also assess what's called substitutability.
Meaning, could someone else provide this service?
Exactly. If the services provided by the Swiss company can't be replaced in a reasonable time, or if the entire national interest depends on this one single entity, well, then the risk of foreign control is considered exponentially higher. The whole law is designed to find and protect those irreplaceable choke points in the Swiss economy.
It's an incredibly sophisticated piece of machinery, built to be legally robust while sending this very clear new signal to the world. But now I think we need to shift from, the architecture of the law to the actual lives of the people who are living through this new reality.
Yeah.
Because a law like this isn't just a document, is it? It's a profound shift on the ground, psychologically and economically, especially for people whose whole lives were built on the idea of a neutral, frictionless Switzerland. You hear the story of someone like Stefan, a microtool factory owner up in the Jura Mountains. It's a third-generation family business. For decades, that Swiss-made stamp was everything. It meant unparalleled quality. It meant pricing power.
The gold standard.
Right. But he was a huge supporter of the ISA, not out of some abstract national pride, but out of what he described as desperation. He calls the act his shield of paper.
A shield of paper.
Yeah. He sees it as this desperate protectionist move because his high-precision business simply cannot compete anymore with the scale, the integration, and the sheer efficiency of East Asian manufacturing.
And Stefan's story, it really captures the central economic tragedy that this law is trying to paper over. The ISA is a tacit admission by the state that these precision industries, which were once the engine of the entire nation, are in relative decline.
The law is a symptom of that decline.
It is. This administrative wall, this shield of paper against what he calls industrial oblivion, it's trying to protect sectors that have already lost their competitive edge. They lost it through decades of offshoring and just, frankly, being out-innovated and outproduced by their competitors.
So the law doesn't actually help him compete better?
No. The state is choosing a short-term security blanket. It's putting up legal firewalls against a superior industrial capacity rather than facing the incredibly hard and painful necessity of radical industrial change at home. The law doesn't solve Stefan's core problem. He still can't make his tools faster or cheaper than his competitors. It just tries to delay the inevitable.
It's the tragedy of a country that got so good at the virtual economy, at finance, that it kind of forgot about the hard physical work. And now it's trying to reverse that with laws and administrative fines.
Exactly. It shows the state is prioritizing protecting what's left over, creating something new and vigorous. The anxiety is just, it's palpable.
Then you look at a completely different world. You look at someone like Mark, a logistics veteran who works the Rhine ports in Basel.
The physical arteries of the country.
For 20 years, his whole job, his identity, was about being the world's lubricant. His job was to ensure that goods flowed without friction through Switzerland, this crucial hub between Northern and Southern Europe.
The efficient middleman.
But the sources show this massive change in his daily work since the ISA and other restrictions started coming in after 2022. His shipping manifests, they used to be purely commercial documents. Now they're clogged with strategic origin declarations and security screening clearances.
And that's the physical reality of this geo-economic shift, the myth of the efficient Swiss hub. It's eroding one form at a time every single day.
The friction is being put back into the system.
Intentionally. These new bureaucratic walls, these clearances, they are the signal that Switzerland is moving from market neutrality to a defensive strategic posture. That slowdown Mark is experiencing is the real-world cost of aligning with one particular bloc. It's a direct consequence of a world where physical control over infrastructure and supply chains is king, and it's forcing a logistical node like Switzerland to introduce friction where its entire value proposition used to be seamlessness.
So Mark's frustration, spending hours on paperwork instead of moving containers, that's the price. That is the strategic transition of these European hubs from market neutrality to defensive screening, all in response to East Asian dominance in the physical world.
It's the strategy made manifest on a loading dock in Zir.
And then, of course, you have the world of high finance. We have the story of Alara, a senior private wealth manager in Zurich. Her entire product, which she sold to her global clients, was fundamentally peace of mind.
Stability, non-alignment.
Exactly. The guarantee that because of Swiss sovereignty, your assets were decoupled from the geopolitical games of the Atlantic bloc or the Eurasian bloc. But after this act passed, she had this dawning realization.
That the promise is broken.
Right. If the government can block the takeover of a power plant for national security reasons, they can absolutely freeze your client's account if the political pressure from Washington or Brussels gets high enough.
And for global wealth management, that is a catastrophic realization. It destroys the entire unique selling proposition of the Swiss system.
It's no longer a special case.
It's not. The ISA, along with Switzerland's decision to align with EU sanctions on Russia, is a clear signal. It says that Swiss finance is now structurally integrated into the broader Western security perimeter, that strategic autonomy you needed for the safe haven model to work, it's gone.
So a banker like Alara can't make that guarantee anymore.
She can't. She can no longer guarantee that capital can be legally and operationally decoupled from geopolitical whims. Her bank is now subject to the same pressures as one in London or New York. And when that happens, global capital, especially capital from non-Western, non-aligned countries, will begin an irreversible search for new, truly neutral alternatives.
This is the erosion of that safe haven model. It's the consequence of being forced by realism to integrate into one of these security blocks at the expense of that prize autonomy.
It's a fundamental loss of credibility in Switzerland's single most valuable commodity, its detachment. And it's clear the ISA is just the economic expression of a much deeper crisis of neutrality that was already well underway.
A crisis that really kicked into high gear with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
That is the essential context for all of this. Switzerland's decision to align with EU sanctions against Russia was a monumental, non-neutral political choice.
And how did they justify that, given their history?
The government argued it was justified under a policy framework from 1993, which allows for sanctions in cases of severe breaches of international law. They frame economic sanctions not as an act of war, but as a tool to restore order and peace, something separate from military involvement.
But they've used sanctions before, haven't they?
Oh, yes. Since 1990, Switzerland has implemented something like 28 different sanctions packages. But the alignment with the West against Russia was on a scale and with a political significance that we haven't seen since the Second World War.
So they chose to align politically and economically, but they drew the line at military neutrality. They've strictly refused to let countries like Germany re-export Swiss-made arms to Ukraine.
And this creates this incredibly complex, difficult dichotomy. They're trying to thread a very fine legal needle. On one hand, they're trying to show political solidarity with the West and adhere to international law. On the other, they have this core legal obligation under their War Material Act to maintain strict armed neutrality.
It seems like an unsustainable contradiction.
It is, and it's forcing them into what you can only call a complex hedging strategy.
Let's talk about that hedging, because it seems to reveal where they really think their future security lies. They're saying arms neutrality on paper, But in practice, they're preparing for military cooperation.
That's it exactly. The Federal Council put out a report after the Ukraine invasion that stated it very clearly. It said that while military neutrality is the foundation of their sovereignty, if Switzerland itself were attacked, they would almost certainly have to rely on international military cooperation. And that requires preparation during peacetime.
Which means getting ready to fight alongside someone else.
It means increasing military interoperability, and we're seeing that happen particularly through joint exercises and adopting standards that align with NATO. It's not full membership, but it is practical operational integration.
So if you connect the dots, they're preparing for military interoperability with NATO, a Western structure, and they're using the ISA to integrate their financial security into the Western legal structure. They have fundamentally changed their definition of non-alignment, haven't they?
They have. They're aligning their operational security and their economic policy with one bloc while trying to maintain the label of neutrality.
The China Act is just the economic side of that coin.
It is. It's the economic parallel to the military hedging. And what it proves really is that genuine total neutrality, the kind that lets you be the frictionless hub for everyone, is now structurally impossible. It's impossible in the military domain and it's impossible in the economic domain.
So neutrality isn't a permanent state of being anymore.
No, it's become a dynamic tool of security policy, something to be adapted and adjusted to align with the dominant strategic environment. And the critical point is that all of these actions, whether it's sanctioning Russia or screening Chinese state investment, reveal a fundamental choice has been made to integrate into the Western defensive bloc. Which brings us back, really, to the fundamental argument that was embedded in your story from that cafe in Bern.
Mm-hmm.
The world has definitively shifted. We've moved from this highly virtualized era of trade where financial hubs and frictionless middlemen could thrive in what was essentially an unchallenged global market. And we've reverted back to a reality that's defined by physical confrontation, by competition for strategic control of real things and real resources.
And that luxurious middle ground, that space where Switzerland lived for 200 years.
It has evaporated. It was a geopolitical anomaly. It was a product of decades of unipolarity, and that era is over.
So now the power dynamics are all about physical control over tangible assets. And you can see two very different global responses taking shape. The Atlantic Alliance, which Switzerland is now, functionally a part of, seems focused on building these administrative fortresses.
Legal and regulatory walls, like the ISA.
Right. It's all about protecting the industrial substance they have left. By its very nature, it's a defensive move. It's a contraction into a culturally defined bloc.
And you can contrast that sharply with the strategy we see in the East, which is focused on creating irreversible physical facts on the ground. The essence of that strategy is Eurasian integration.
Not building legal walls, but building bridges. Literally.
Literally. We see it manifested not in new regulations, but in tangible infrastructure. The massive new rail lines, the deep water ports, the energy pipelines, all the complex infrastructure being built under initiatives like the Belt and Road.
So the goal is to physically bind the Eurasian supercontinent together.
Yeah, precisely. To create tangible economic interdependence and connectivity across regions that were previously fragmented. It's an attempt to build a new continental organism that is, in a functional sense, self-sufficient and internally connected. While the West is debating screening laws and tariffs, the East is building the physical skeleton for the next global economic core.
So if that's the long-term trend, this rise of a physically integrated Eurasian continent, how should we analyze the Swiss decision to pass the ISA and align their whole financial security system so closely with the Atlantic bloc?
Well, the analysis has to be that it looks less like a proactive, forward-looking strategy and more like a capitulation driven by a very immediate, short-term security anxiety about industrial takeovers.
They're reacting to a present fear, not positioning for a future reality.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
By choosing to align politically and legally with a power bloc, the Atlantic system that is defining itself more and more by its exclusion of this rising Eurasian core, Switzerland is risking the very thing that made it unique. It's risking its potential future role.
Which was to be that indispensable commercial link between the blocs.
The truly neutral nexus. By choosing administrative protection and alignment today, it risks strategic marginalization from what will likely be the largest and fastest growing economic area in the world tomorrow.
That's a very stark assessment. It suggests they chose the immediate comfort of political alignment over the much harder, long-term strategic necessity of remaining indispensable to all the major powers.
That's what it looks like. And from a sort of collective survival perspective, in this new age of physical competition, true long-term security doesn't come from laws written on parchment. It doesn't come from promises of neutrality or even from alliance memberships.
Where does it come from?
It's forged in genuine industrial self-sufficiency and what you could call civilizational resilience. It's the fundamental ability to produce, maintain, and innovate within your own physical and technological ecosystem.
The ability to make the things you need to survive.
And in that context, the ISA doesn't look like an assertion of robust Swiss sovereignty. It looks more like a reluctant, formal transfer of responsibility. Switzerland is, in effect, entrusting its survival to a system, the Atlantic system, that is itself visibly grappling with relative industrial decline and deep internal challenges. It's prioritizing legal protection over building its own independent physical strength.
So the law is almost like a confession that the nation is afraid it can't keep up with the industrial speed and capacity of the world outside its mountains because it failed to maintain that pace itself.
It's the signature on a document that effectively mortgages the nation's future to a geopolitical bloc that is engaged in a rearguard action against the gravitational pull of a new economic center of gravity. The national focus has decisively shifted. It's no longer, how do we produce better and more efficiently than anyone else? It's become, how do we legally stop others from taking control of the few strategic assets we have left?
So this deep dive into one piece of legislation, the Investment Screening Act, it really reveals something much bigger than a simple regulatory change. It's the documentation of a world being fundamentally rewired.
It is. The 2026 China Act is the final formal notice. It's the acknowledgement that the luxury of political and financial neutrality was an economic advantage that belonged to a unique moment in history, and that moment has passed.
And the choice Switzerland made was between that fading virtual financial identity, the safe haven model, and the much more visceral physical need for security in a world that is now dominated by tangible industrial substance.
A choice made not from a position of strength, but out of structural necessity.
And that choice leaves us with a really indelible observation about the era we are now entering.
I think so. In the coming years, the power to define the rules and to enforce them isn't going to belong to those who write them most eloquently on parchment or who facilitate their flow through financial centers. It's going to belong to those who control the physical means of their enactment, the factories, the networks, and the core technologies that sustain an industrial civilization. The age of the haven is over. The age of the continent has begun.